Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Rekindling Democracy, Professional's Guide to Working in Citizen Space. My name is Heather Keem and I'm the team lead for the city's deepening community practice area. To shake things up a little, I'm not going to be moderating the webinar. I'm going to be doing the tech support and learning alongside with you. So welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to do a land recognition. So before we begin this webinar, by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real for our communities. So I'd like to welcome Rute and to start the session.
Hi, thanks Heather, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just before we kick things off, I'd like to introduce you to my co-host, Jonathan Masney. Jonathan is a supervisor at the City of Kitchener and also a champion for the deepening community work. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks.
So since you're a seasoned ABCD practitioner, maybe we can kind of give people a bit of a frame about what ABCD is, just to help us guide our discussion for today.
I believe seasoned is another word for old. I'm feeling older these days, but so the ABCD approach was developed by John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann. And personally, I was first introduced to the ABCD approach through the book they co-authored, Building Communities from the Inside Out. So this way of working in community differs from what is known as a needs-based approach, where the focus is on a community's deficiencies. ABCD puts the emphasis on a community's gifts. So in so doing, it maintains that a community has the capacity, and this is outside of institutional intervention, to address many of the issues they may be facing. So when I began to use ABCD, certain elements of the approach stood out to me. The first being the belief that everyone has a gift to contribute. Second, this idea that relationships are key to building community. And third, and this really struck me, is care is the commitment of citizens one to another. So in regards to this point, by their very nature, human service institutions cannot offer care. Rather, by identifying and meeting needs, institutions ultimately render individuals powerless, resulting not in relationships of love, but of relationships of dependence. So in this reality, people come to believe that they do not have enough power or resources to truly affect change. So contrary to this, ABCD is about empowering people, creating space for individuals to offer their gifts, and the fostering of caring relationships. And that's all I have to say on the matter.
All right, I'm really excited to actually dig into the conversation with Cormac. So maybe you want to introduce him and then we'll get started.
Will do. I have my notes here. Cormac is a faculty member of the ABCD Institute and an internationally renowned thought leader, trainer, and speaker. He has supported the establishment of more than 30 ABCD learning sites in Rwanda, South Sudan, Kenya, Canada, Sweden, Ireland, and the UK. He is driven by a passionate belief in the importance of localism, economic and environmental sovereignty, and is a strong advocate for the protection of Indigenous living and social justice. Cormac, a longtime friend and collaborator with Professor John McKnight, has published extensively in professional journals on asset-based approaches to probation, health, aging well, community housing, community development, and disability. And a fun fact for Cormac, you are the last person I hugged outside of my social bubble before the pandemic happened, in a restaurant in Brantford, Ontario, Canada. We were in the shadow of when things were about to happen. You were the last hug.
Welcome, Cormac. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So for people in the audience who may not have read the book yet, what inspired you to write it, and what are some key points you would like them to take away?
Thanks, Rita. The book has been written over many, many decades, really. I sat down about 6 years ago and really started to zero in on what I might commit to paper. And largely, the book is full of stories that I have had the privilege of hearing as I've traveled around the world. I often see myself as an itinerant storyteller, certainly prior to COVID. So there's that component. And I hope that the stories nourish people who read them as much as they nourished me in my journey. So they're not my stories, they're stories that I hold in trust and that the book shares in good faith. The other dimension of the book is I wanted to really be with the stories in the same way that wayfinders call us to attend to Indigenous wisdom and say, what are these stories calling forth from us in terms of today and in terms of where we're going from here? And to really think about that in real terms. So one of the things I hope people will take away is that things are not getting worse. They're getting clearer. The term I've heard people use of late, apocalypse, actually means that there's a set of circumstances afoot at the moment which are giving clarity in a way that could not be brought to bear in any other fashion but for these circumstances and how they're acting on us. So what I'm hoping is that the book it acts like a wayfinder. There isn't a path out of the challenges that we're facing at the moment, but there is a compass. So the book invites us to attend to the compass, or a compass, that says, at the moment, the way we tend to try to light the path ahead of us is by finding more services, finding more money, essentially the dominant story is one that says we'll be better because professionals and experts and institutions will make us better. And that story is dangerous for two reasons. One is it will burn out our professionals because we're asking them to do citizen work and they can't, quite frankly. And the second reason it's harmful is it's actually causing the capacity that exists in civic life to recede. Another way of saying that, Rute, is to say we're experiencing in Western cultures and in cultures that have started to copy Western ideals, we're experiencing an inversion of democracy, where the role of the professional is dominant. So we're defining the role of the citizen as that which comes after the professional. Now, that's a technocracy, not a democracy. And what we need to get to is a situation where the role of the professional is defined as that which happens after the important work of the citizen is done. Now, the next question is, what's the work of the citizen individually and collectively? And that's what I'm hoping this book invites us into as a conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I found myself asking that question too, like what's my role as an individual, questioning my role as a citizen and how I play into that, giving the power to the institution. So yeah, it definitely causes you to question those things for sure.
Here.
Yeah.
Cormac, the book is Rekindling Democracy. And my question to you is, how would you define democracy, and why is it important?
Yeah, it's so ephemeral, isn't it? It's one of those things that nearly everybody takes for granted, but we desperately miss if it were gone. So I think it's important to say that democracy is not a fixed thing. It's something that is enacted, and it's enacted by the people who show up and the way that they show up in each other's lives. So in that sense, it's about power and how we act powerfully and affectively as well as effectively together. So a way of thinking about this is that our power in that sense would be that we act in a way that doesn't diminish anybody else or the natural environment within which we move and which moves through us. So a democratic way of being is, I think, a collective way of figuring out how our gifts, our knowledge, our passions, and our skills can be brought together and made fruitful in such a way that we learn how to be better as humans together, and our planet is better because of that. So that's my definition of democracy. If democracy worked like it should.
So,
with the power residing among the people.
Well, it resides among the people because their action is to create the power. So in a sense, yes, it's a verb. Democracy is a verb, not a noun. We live into it, and it is the fruits of our showing up with each other and the way we do so, or not, as the case may be.
And we only recognize it when it's in action.
Yep.
Okay.
And when it isn't, you know, eventually, after we stop blaming everything else, eventually we start to really get to the root of the issues that are before us, which is the absence of it.
so on that point then, why do you think we made that shift? Because it seems like community and having community power to act, like it seems like it's more beneficial. So what shifted in our culture that we started giving that power to institutions, to government?
Well, there were a range of different factors, and this is, I think, historically, it's quite recent. So across the long arc of the human story, most of us lived nomadic lives, and we lived in groups certainly no more than 150 in number. And then as we started moving into settlements, depends on how you date this, but let's not fall into an argument, somewhere between 12 and 8,000 years ago, and became agrarian. Started domesticating animals and, you know, beginning to figure out how do we do this living on the planet together. There's something about us having to, in those contexts, really be interdependent and reliant on each other. And the arc of the human story over the last 8,000 years, and in particular since the Second World War, so there's much more recent history, has really shifted along. First 8,000 years, very much along the lines of, you know, we had conflicts, we, you know, figured things out, we fell out with each other, we united together, but largely they were very, very small scale stories. So they were stories not of states or of governments or, you know, of very significant federal entities, but very, very small regions. And so our story was, as humans, small and local and about proximity. We fought over patches. Over the last 100 years, a couple of things have happened, and largely down to scale. We have started moving into a phase of giantism. Economically, that's known as globalization. In war, we've had 2 world wars. So scale, we've always had war, but the scale at which we've seen war and we've seen conflict over the last 100 or more years is quite significant. Now, the First World War had a massive shock effect. You know, you also had during that period, it's worth noting, given the pandemic we're currently in, the 1918 pandemic as well. So there was massive shockwaves economically, socially, in society. And one of the things historically happened was, as the First World War came to an end, it was a very lucrative event for the captains of industry. They became very, very worried about how they were going to continue to sustain the level of income and capital that they enjoyed during the First World War. And there are a range of different versions of this story, but one of the things that started to happen was that industry, the world of capital, started to really kick in and start teaching us a different way of thinking about need. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Edward Bernays later on with Jonathan. But the Second World War was even more significant, because the Second World War really, I think, just had a massive impact on people. And the Second World War was while the first was about how industry changed our minds and how we thought about our communities, the Second World War was about a new settlement. The Second World War introduced this idea that, with the Great Depression and with the world wars that happened, that there had to be a better way of enabling people to be economically and socially well. So we saw in England, for example, the introduction of the NHS. We saw in the US the Marshall Plan and so on. Now, all good so far, except something happened in the 40s, which wasn't so good. And that was a new story was introduced to the human psyche. And that story was the best way to divide wealth among people is to provide services to them through paid professional intervention. Again, that's an amoral story. It's neither right nor wrong. But if you scale that up in a community that indigenously for thousands of years was used to being interdependent, and you say, well, actually, after the First World War, your good life is in the marketplace. After the Second World War, by the way, the marketplace now extends also to human services. Is it any surprise that people become schooled into thinking that institutions are where you learn, where you become well, where you get your needs met? And so I think, the idea of we were schooled to think that way over the course of the last 100 years, we're coming into 2021. So over the course of an arc of 100 years, we have begun to see that people have shifted towards what essentially is an institutional assumption. The assumption that my health is in the hands of a doctor, my child's education is in the hands of a teacher, my well-being is in the hands of somebody else who manages it and is paid to do whatever it is they do. So I think that shift has happened over time. It's a schooling, a socialization. I don't think we intentionally did it. But what we've actually been engaged in is thinking of ourselves as clients or as consumers. And while over the course of history, what we've learned to do is either have an allegiance to a monarch, which is to call ourselves a subject, or an allegiance to each other, which is to call ourselves a citizen. Citizens have allegiance to other citizens. And the third wave in human history is to have allegiance to ourselves and the marketplace, otherwise known as a client or a consumer. And here we all are. The short history.
I think that's a pretty good breakdown. And I'm kind of thinking too, when you talk about this shift, it's even now we're not really seeing good news about community. There's always something wrong with community. So even then you don't necessarily see the positive impact it could have because we're not being socialized to see that anymore. So that's also adding to the shift, I think. And yeah,
it is. Yeah. I mean, I have huge hope. I have huge hope, especially in light of the precipitating effect of COVID-19. I loved the 60s. I loved the idea of freedom and individuality and finding yourself. The problem is that we just went too far with it. And I think what's starting to happen is people are starting to, the results of that experiment are in, and it is not pandemic proof. But what's also really clear is that what we've begun to see is this massive self-organizing, this mutualizing of community in response to the pandemic. And I suppose the question might be, once we pedal out of COVID-19, I think we'll be pedaling into other pandemics in the future is my sense. So we need to move into a little bit of a pandemic conscious way of understanding our lived experience. But I think what we also can carry forward now is the empirical evidence that community is not just something nice to have. It's essential for a good life. That it really is the survival of the most connected. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of hope, is what I'm saying.
And thank you for sharing that hope with us. So my question is what I believe is the foundation of your work, asset-based community development. And so my question is, you mentioned that asset-based community development is not a substitute for services. What do you mean by that?
That's a great question. There's a couple of different reasons I would make a statement like that. One is because I want to make a distinction or to caution against a misunderstanding, which could, result from some of the literature as people review it. I guess originally when I said it, one of the things I was observing was that I saw a lot of agencies adopting asset-based community development and doing it to or for people in the same way they do other programs. And particularly following austerity, following a lot of economic cuts to traditional services as a way of trying to mobilize community into action. But invariably what I would hear in their narrative is, oh, we're trying to get more volunteers to help out. We're trying to get more people to engage in, and I'd say, but help out in what? Get engaged in what? And it was invariably in services. And what I wanted to really call people to is that asset-based community development, and they're clumsy. It's a clumsy set of words put together, isn't it? Really, but if we strip back those words, what we're talking about is something that's outside of the contractual world, something that's outside of the programmatic or transactional experience, and something that is a dance of the heart, something that is covenantal, something that is communal, something that is priceless because it isn't about being paid to do it. So in a very real sense, the same way that just before I came on the call, it's 6:24 p.m. here where I am in Dublin. I had a bite to eat with my family. I asked one of my children to pass the salt. They didn't do that as a service. He didn't say, yes, I will, but it'll cost you 50 cents. And if he did, he'd know all about it. But that isn't our relationship. Our relationship is, to go back to what you were saying earlier on, Jonathan, it's love. It's an exchange of mutuality and cooperation. And that's not service. So it's really important in our language. We go back to what I was saying to Rute earlier on. If services and service land is the sea in which we move or we swim, then if we're going to have a conversation about ABCD, we need to get out of that water and get on a new bank and talk about this is a different space. That's essentially why I subtitled the book A Professional's Guide to Working in Citizen Space, because this isn't about how professionals can go in and do community engagement to get citizens to come back to their space or their programs. This is about how can we, with integrity and without hubris, walk alongside citizens so they can be interdependent in natural communities with services in reserve as and when they're needed, but hopefully reducing the need for them. So in many respects, I would say I've advocated over the years, as I know many people on this call have, that asset-based community development, so this is the second point, is not about saving systems money. It's about saving people from systems and from services, right? From day-wasting services and giving them a life, not a service. And that is essentially the work of an ethical civic practitioner who's lucky enough to be paid by a service. Their primary job is to keep people out of their services, not get them in. The service are there as reserve. It's proof you failed. You haven't done your community building. And sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes there is no other way around that. But it's a supplement. It's not the primary intervention. And currently, sadly, too many things are appropriated by services, including asset-based community development. So I would, that's where I was coming from with that distinction.
And I agree with you. So often ABCD is used as a drill bit to mine community resources for the purposes of the institution. And even the term volunteer, that's language from systems and institutional world, where the volunteer is the unpaid worker that works on behalf of the institution to fulfill the purposes of said institution. We don't talk about in the community life, it's relationships, it's not the volunteer category. And that's the language that I think is important to unpack. Are we using ABCD in order to support our institution, or is it a perspective or a way of being that the community appropriates and begins to do for themselves? It's an important distinction. Thanks for clearing it up. I found that phrase very provocative, so I brought it up, and I'm like...
I would say it's an important distinction, Jonathan, is that asset-based community development is not a model, right? All models are wrong, some are useful, but it's not even a model. It is a description of how local people are effective in their relationships with each other. That's it. So, you know, you could dress that up. You could say it's an anthropological description. It's an ethnographic description. I'm relaxed about that, but it is not a model. And I'm really struck by the amount of times I will see people say, you know, we're using the ABCD model. And even that, again, is reflective of the fact that as of yet, their understanding of the heart of what we're talking about is still, well, it's still in growth, or still, you know, being seasoned.
It pierces me right through the heart when I hear ABCD toolkit that is created and used by individuals that are doing community work on behalf of institutions.
It's well intentioned, you know, but every time I see it, I think, can I have some fries with that?
Yeah, exactly. I'll take combo number 2.
And to that point then, because you're mentioning you want people to focus more on like citizens focusing on citizens rather than the services for the citizens. So I'm curious then, like, what would you say to people who argue, you know, we have government deliverables or funded deliverables, internal goals, like, but then we're also trying to meet community needs? Like sometimes those two things are separate. So how do they balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a couple of thoughts on that. One, it's important to understand that a lot of the time when we're talking about community needs, what we're actually talking about is service categorizations or service categories. So it's almost like there's a confusion of community needs or a conflation of community needs with service categories. And the evidence of this is pretty clear in my mind. If you look at an agency that doggedly sticks with, you know, an intervention in the community, starting with a needs assessment or a gap analysis, and you look at what their conclusion based on that needs analysis is, the conclusion invariably is that the people who are being analyzed require the services of those who are analyzing them. Now, that's not a needs analysis. That's a categorization of people into a drop-down menu of services. So what we're doing actually is we're making the fix, the institutional fix fit, you know, the situation, rather than really deeply being alongside people and understanding what a good life looks like, what a good day looks like for them. So another way of saying that is to say that, you know, the only thing that needs analysis is needs analysis. You know, that the actual way of engaging, of understanding people is in itself flawed. It's a setup, which means that our relationships and the power dynamic of our relationships are going to be problematic from the outset. Now, we can flip that on its head though, and we can do something constructive. So I don't mind actually if an agency says to me, I really want to meet people's needs. That's what that's what we exist. That's our mission. That's why I became a professional. I don't just want to, you know, focus on their strengths. There are real issues here. There's poverty here. That, you know, people are dying of hunger. I can't just focus on strengths. And I have a lot of sympathy for that position, actually. But what I would say is okay, so how can we be authentic about really understanding what it is that people need? You know, my understanding of human beings is we're all pretty much of a common nature. We all need someone to love, somewhere to live, something meaningful to do. I've never, ever met an Indigenous person who said, you know, I need, and then defined that need in institutional intervention. So I think this is really important. We've used the term need in the same way that the market is using the term need. So if we want to get serious about needs, well, one of the things that I think we would start with is a recognition that the only way we can understand what people need as outside agencies is if they really understand, first of all, how they can use their own resources locally, and then what would supplement those resources. If we don't do it in that sequence, the danger is that we will move in and colonize. So I'm good with needs if that's what people want to focus on. I don't think we're going to win this argument, so let's go with it. But I would ask people to be authentic about it then, if that's the case. And there's a world of difference between a needs conversation where we're genuinely and authentically hearing a person into expression around their need to live a full life, and categorizing and siloing and segregating somebody into a unit of need that I've defined as an institution. That one is colonization and the other is love. So I think most people on this call want to be in loving, supportive relationships, not colonizing. So we need to be really clear and careful about our language.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question. I went off on a slight tangent there, Ute. Forgive me.
No. That was really good. And I was actually going to ask Jonathan, being from like a municipality, like I would be curious to hear kind of how things are on that side.
Well, so working with the municipality, so I'm in the community center world, and a lot of my work utilizing asset-based community development is in relation to work with youth. And we've done a couple of things utilizing ABCD in the development of a skills library, connecting adults and youth through the sharing of their skills and interests. And one of the insights that emerged out of that work was when we're talking about youth or things in relation to youth, we want to put things in place for them to be successful adults down the road. And I had a conversation with our good friend John McKnight about this, and he has a way of turning a phrase, and he said, well, we look at youth not as beings, but as becomings, right? And when we think about youth simply as becomings, we're always focusing on their future, and then look at their present deficiencies and make sure the right things are in place so that they become productive adults down the road, rather than recognizing that there are current beings with gifts, skills, interests, and how do we hold space for them to belong and express who they are in these spaces. So that was a major learning in my municipal work, because we're framing everything in terms of youth as becoming rather than youth as being, and that they too are citizens. They too can enact democracy and connect with adults in meaningful ways and share what they know and contribute back to the community. So that was a switch that was flipped in our thinking.
I think that's actually a pretty good tie to the question I had next. I just wanted to bring a youth perspective to this discussion. So I'm curious, because in the book you mentioned, Cormac, there's this chart. It's to, for, by, with, to the community, for the community, with the community, and by the community. Could you elaborate a bit more about this? And in doing that, maybe touch on how institutions can better support youth too, because a lot of the time there's this like definition of at risk or disengaged or underrepresented. So, you know, that kind of alienates youth, I think, a little bit. So maybe you can touch on how they can get more involved in community with that support, but also leading in community actions.
Yeah. Well, just in top slicing the question, I think to, for, with, and by is just a simple way, I think, of saying, well, if as an outside actor intending to be helpful, be useful to a community, we're doing things to people or for people, that's an act of violence. And I'm sorry to be so bland, but we're running out of time, and it's critical we maximize our time together. But when you do things to people or for people that they haven't actually had any part in shaping themselves, unless it's a crisis or an emergency. I mean, if I get a heart attack and you have a defibrillator, knock yourself out, do something to me, save my life. But in most terms, it's an act of violence. It's devaluing the other person or diminishing of the other person. So we want to move into the space where we're doing things. Typically, I think in Canada, what we're very fond of talking about is with, and that's true in Europe and the US and Australia too. I think ABCD goes further, right? And this is where the two for with by comes into a fourth quadrant. If you kind of think about this like a crossroads, you know, there are times when 2 and 4 is valid. But what I would say is ideally, if you're working with liberation and you're working not to provide relief action or relief services, but to change the social order. In other words, you're interested in social justice, right? Then I think for the long haul, what you would want to be trying to do is to support people to do the things together themselves and have ownership and have agency around those things over time. So to shape what they want to do themselves in terms of what issues they want to address or possibilities they want to pursue, to shape the solutions or the responses to the problems and possibilities, and then to act, because there's something incredible about flexing your civic muscle. And this is where young people come in, you know, to take Jonathan's point, you know, it isn't just beings. Young people are beings. They're also beings that live in a culture which is about defining your being as having. What do you have right now or what you don't have? And what we're saying is to be is not just to have or to consume, but it is to contribute. To be is to be in an act of communion with others, to contribute to the well-being of your community. Now, in Eastern African ancient country views of the world, so you go on country, you go into indigenous community. The word geni, the word genius, comes from that part of the world, and it's the belief that as a young person you have a genius, you have something that needs to be brought into the world, that the world essentially needs, that the cosmos is out of sync until you bring it into the world. And part of, I think, the work of working alongside young people is to organize the village so that it can call that forth and can create a halo of support around young people to say, you're not a leader or a citizen of tomorrow, you're a citizen of today. You have a genius, you have a gift, and not alone can you not be full and well and whole without the sharing of that gift and the discovery of that, but we as a community can't be either. So it is our collective combined calling to figure that out, you know. And I think in that sense, once you recognize that, you would never ever again use the term youth at risk. You would actually use the term youth at promise, and the promise becomes fulfilled when the young person recognizes that they're needed, you know, because this is the great healing moment when a young person says, I am enough, I am somebody, I am needed, and I am missed on the days I don't show up. I better show up. I have no fear of that young person. I don't think poverty will get them. I don't think mental health will get them. I think they will be well and they will be resilient on and into the future. And that's the work, I think.
That's actually a good point. And I think there's a quote in the book that summarizes it, or a question. It was, who has a better stake in the future than young people? And I think it just sums it up really nicely.
We also want to be mindful of time. Heather, do we want to go to our panel or continue with one more question?
Let's move on to the panel, and we can incorporate our questions that we didn't get to. And there's lots of questions from the audience that we can be pulling in.
Yeah, I knew we could keep going with the questions, but I'll pull in Madeleine and Donna Marie. So Madeleine's from Crew Toronto and is working in St. Jamestown, and Donna Marie Dunk is from Bridges to Belonging. Welcome, ladies. You can just give us like a brief intro about your organization, and based on the 7 principles listed out here on the slides, it would just tell us like what areas your organizations are working in and what some challenges are. Donna Marie, you want to go?
Sure, I didn't know that you wanted to go first. Thank you so much for having me part of this. And Cormac, what a ongoing learning I keep receiving every time I listen and read this work. Bridges to Belonging started actually as a small group of families with with young adults with disabilities. And those families had come out of, for the most part, the institutional movement where people with disabilities were institutionalized. And with a very clear vision that their youth and their young adults were people, were citizens, and were deserving of a life of their own and of their choice, to have their voice and to be able to be supported in that in whatever way they needed. And so that's our roots, where we came from, and have evolved over the last number of years, but have not lost the vision or mission to recognize the power. And, you know, we're always careful to not even talk about empowering, because I don't have to give you power. You already have your power. You own your own power. I was on a call just this morning talking to somebody about, you know, the trick is getting out of the way. Like, let people be and become, as you were talking about as well. So the work that we do is, we have no programs. I wouldn't even say we actually have services, but I struggle for a better term. We are facilitators and we are connectors. And I would say mostly we're facilitators of people having a good life in community, and families and you know, people themselves all experiencing peace of mind and health and well-being. So we really do facilitate that process. It's more of a practice and a set of principles than it is a model or a process, because it is completely person and family centered. And I shouldn't just say that, because we work with a network of support as well, and I can share more about that, what that looks like. But really, it is about, you know, maybe Cormac, I call them sort of micro communities, that people build a community of their own, because sometimes their natural neighborhood is not conducive to supporting them in the life that they want to live. And so I'm sure there's a lot more work we can do on that piece and learn from the community of practice around ABCD. But at this point, we work directly with an individual. You know, in terms of connection, that's what we do. We don't do anything in a segregated or a congregated way. That's the bridge in my background, is we look to build those bridges and overcome whatever those barriers are to inclusion for people. So I guess I could say, if I had to put it in a phrase, we're like a full inclusion service, for lack of a better term.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. Madeline, you want to tell us a bit about your organization?
CREW stands for Community Resilience to Extreme Weather, and it arose out of the ice storm in Toronto 2013. There seemed to be a huge concern about emergency preparedness at the community level. And it took about 3 years for us to get a little bit of a start on some community approaches. And the first thing that we did, we were invited, looking at the 7 principles, we were invited by a co-op in St. Jamestown to come and work on the emergency situation, because because of the nature of the community. It's very fragile, and it doesn't have a lot of supports, as it were, from the city. And it is very diverse, and many different ethno-cultural groups. And so the host invited us in. So the first thing that we did was, you know, not presuming what the interests were, we did hold some mapping workshops, and we found that there was a huge interest in the food issue. And the food issue was linked to emergencies, because there had been fires in the past, and people were unable to provide food for their neighbors. So we, after about 2 years in the community, and this kind of goes to the speed of trust, it's taken about 3 years for us to get to the point where we're seen as an asset, and that's kind of not sure where that's going to go. But our work then, we decided to work in one building, and we we were able, before the pandemic, well, during the first 3 years, we developed a steering committee from the whole neighborhood. And then just before the pandemic, we were able to recruit 14 volunteers. And the idea was, it was going to be neighbor helping neighbor, floor by floor. In case of an emergency, what would you do? And to get to know your neighbors and to find out, who had a large family, might need help with the children, who was disabled, and this kind of thing, and hoping, that we will be able to prepare in advance. So in any case, then the pandemic struck, and we had a lot of WhatsApp networks. So we had communications networks, and we were actually asking ourselves, well, do we have a mandate now? Because, we're for emergency preparedness. Now we have an emergency. What are we going to do? So, but it turned out that then the service providers called on us to distribute food boxes, because it is an area of food insecurity. And when the funding came out from the government, there was somebody received it, but they didn't have the networks to get into the buildings to find out who needs the food. So we found ourselves kind of in the service area, but we actually had people that could spread the word. So local people were able to go and put up posters, and then actually do the heavy lifting of moving the boxes, from apartment to apartment. So that was one thing that we did. Now, the thing with this area is this neighborhood, it is 17,000 people, so it's way too big, and we discovered that we had to focus in on a smaller area. But we made a lot of connections with the community leaders, and we're getting to know more about what is going on in the community there, and we're hoping to work with others. It's going to be around emergency preparedness. But we've noticed capacity. I mean, there's tremendous capacity in the neighborhood. For instance, when I gave a talk about emergencies to an ESL group, they were from all over the world, and they said, "Well, we know about emergencies. We've been through wars. We've been through famines. We know how to store food. We will help you with your project." Because, and this is where I think it's an unrecognized assets live in that community, but there needs to be a path. Anyway, that's about it for what we've done, and thank you for the opportunity.
That's awesome, and thank you for sharing. It sounds like you're doing a lot of great work. I just want to make sure we have time to pull in questions from people. So I'll start with you, Madeline and Donna Marie. Have you ever, this question is from Jim in the audience. Have you ever used the ABCD in collaboration with community groups or individuals alongside a business entity? And have you achieved any genuine engagement or collaboration with the community?
Well, as far as working with a business entity, not so far. And as far as, what was the last part? Working with the community?
Yeah, and if there were any genuine engagement or collaboration that came out from it.
Well, we feel that we do have, a number of people that are engaged, and they are working with their neighbors, and there are a few things that we're pulling together. So yeah, I think it's working. Once we focused on one building, I think it's that started to happen.
Yeah, for us, because we work with with people's lives, all aspects of their lives. There are folks who are looking to get engaged through some form of meaningful work, or they're looking to find some form of employment at some point. And so we engage with the individual. We walk with them to the work that they're looking for, or to that volunteer place that they're looking for. And so there have been folks that have become involved in a volunteer activity as sort of en route to work to do some skill development. And so in that sense, we would connect with the business. But we're always sort of alongside, almost in the background, right? So it's like we're the one step behind the individual to support them in being able to self-advocate. So again, a lot of times advocacy, there's that sense that we need to advocate for them. And so we facilitate those conversations. We may go through a mock conversation with them to let them understand what might be the conversation that would happen, what might be the question, how comfortable are you with that, you know, how might you answer that? So just to prepare and support them to be able to get into that conversation with their boss or their volunteer manager. And then with their permission, or if they ask us, we can offer to maybe come into that workplace or that place where they're volunteering and have a conversation with some people that they're feeling particularly connected to at work. And so those work mates or volunteer mates may very well become their new network or a new person in their support network. So that we're not, you know, again, you know, and to Cormac's point, we're very mindful that we don't create dependencies. So people don't need to become dependent on us. It's difficult enough for us not to be seen as another service provider in what we do, and to be constantly readjusting and repositioning both ourselves and the community and the people we work with to understand that we're here to facilitate the process, not to drive or direct or, you know, contrive it in any way. So we work with the people, we work in the community, and we work with businesses, but alongside the individual.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point, and it ties to the next question about the hydraulic effect. And maybe I'll just ask this to everyone, and Jonathan, feel free to jump in as well. Cormac, you talk about the hydraulic effect in the book. Maybe talk a little bit about that and how people can keep that balance.
Yeah, so it's a basic idea. So hydraulics basically is when one side goes down, the other goes up, vice versa. Okay, so I use this to talk about the power relationship, or what I would call the reflexive or unseen power relationship between communities and institutions. Okay, so this isn't intended, but can often happen. So it's a recurring pattern, whereby whether community starts to outsource or relocate some function that historically, traditionally was held by the community. And slowly over time, that function starts to become professionalized and institutionalized, and the institution starts to be seen to be more competent and credentialized to deal with that particular issue. Health is a case in point. All of the evidence in epidemiology says 85% of what determines our health and well-being has absolutely nothing got to do with doctors' interventions, hospitals, or pharmacological interventions. It's well accepted, it's well evidenced, and it's really obvious, actually. Even a moment's thought would reveal that. And yet people are schooled in the assumption that my health is in the hands of a doctor. So this is an example of the relocation. So one of the things that I'm trying to say in the hydraulic relationship is, once we can begin to see the unseen, the reflexive kind of relationship, we can then begin to do something, both in civic life and in professional life, because inside every public servant is a citizen waiting to be liberated. Okay, so we can all come and play here. So the hydraulic relationship in terms of citizenship, it would almost be like a syringe where the citizen is pulling up power that it either gave away or sometimes has become appropriated by the system. Like, for example, where a family becomes disabled by a set of professionals who say, well, actually, you know, we're best placed to deal with this person because they've got an intellectual disability. And what would you know about somebody with an intellectual disability? We're trained to do that. So give him to us and we'll look after him. So that's an example of a set of functions, and function seems like a cold word, but I mean the love, the care, the natural supports, and sometimes the very, very sophisticated ways that a person can have a valorized social role in a community start to be moved over into institutional space. So we can reclaim that through resistance, through community organizing, through building collective power, through creating community alternatives for institutional space. I talk in the book, for example, about the region of Emilia-Romagna in Italy, where 1 in every 3 euros is generated by cooperatives, huge political power. So when the community says, we don't want our older people to be institutionalized into residential homes, we want to create alternatives within our own communities, which are more culturally appropriate. That's an example of the cooperative movement pulling the the hydraulic relationship, pulling the dynamic back up again in the direction of community. And the institution may resist, or it may go in that direction. The other point, is the last point I'll make, because time is not with us here, is sometimes institutions, particularly heretics in institutions, or what I would describe actually as ethical practitioners, decide my job is to relocate some of my authority and the institution's assets so it actually builds up the power of community rather than extracts people from the community and redefines them out of community and into service land. So what they might do is, I talk about this in the book, for example, a warden of a prison saying, I waste $77,000 a year incarcerating your sons and your neighbors' children. And what I want to do is launder that money back into community alternatives. I know that the alumni of my prisons come from the same 15 neighborhoods. Let's have a conversation in these neighborhoods that stops this, feeding frenzy, which basically takes human lives and creates a form of human sacrifice called the incarceration system, which is largely just a business. This is why we really have to try to do something. And it's interesting, even in relation to the defunding of police. There's the problem with that is that what we'll do is we'll take the money away from the police and we'll put it into another institution around mental health. What we actually need to do is go further upstream and create community alternatives that actually are indigenous and exist within the community. That's the starting point. And to do that, I think we need people in the institutional world who redefine the question they're asking. And the question is it gets redefined not as what can we do to reform our system, but what can we do to refunction community? The minute that starts to happen, it's a game changer. So that's the hydraulic relationship in total.
I really enjoyed that metaphor and reading in the book, and I love having these mental images. It actually led to me Googling how hydraulics work, and I started reading. I was like, "What are you doing?" So just to expand on the metaphor, like within a hydraulic, there's a downward pressure, and the downward pressure that a community puts on itself is the outsourcing of its roles. My question is, what is some downward pressure that can be put on institutions by the community, simply outside of just organizing? And in my original question, it was, is there room for Alinsky-style organizing where we can mobilize people to, and one of the questions here is there a role for political small p activism?
There is, but it's amazing to me how quickly and how easy it is to do some of this. I was with a community recently where they were having a huge amount of issues with local crime, and they kept calling the police. The police wouldn't come because it's not a neighborhood they want to go into, until a number of local residents, leaders, called the police chief and said, look, we've called for help quite a long time now, and we're not getting any response, but don't worry, we just wanted you to know that we're actually taking the matter into our own hands, and within the next half an hour we'll have a response ourselves. Thank you, and hung up. And within 15 minutes there were 15 squad cars in that neighborhood. So it's really interesting to me because there's something also about playing the long game and the smart game here. Often we hand our power over really quite easily and quite willingly, which ironically, in the process of outsourcing and handing, the function, the responsibility over to an institution, also causes a huge amount of harm to the practitioners in the institution. I think it's one of the ways that we're burning out really good, caring practitioners. So yes, advocacy and organizing is fine, but here's the problem, Jonathan. Most anger organizing, most advocacy is focused on trying to change the institution so it will provide a better service for the citizens. instead of trying to change the institutions so that the resource and the assets that the institution are currently holding can be put at the disposal of the community, and so they can create better alternatives. So I'd be very interested in thinking about how you can use advocacy and activism and organizing, not to get the institution to change, but so that we can create better ways of distributing wealth to enable communities to cooperatize and self-organize so that there's an economic floor for everybody, because most of the problems are economic or social. And also there's a set of prospects available to every young person as they go forward. The next 2 years is not a great time to start your career, but there can be all kinds of really meaningful activities that can happen in community that if we don't start creating them now over the next couple of years, I fear we're just creating a whole new generation that will be outsourced to the institutional world. So I think we need to be clear about what it is that we're trying to create downward pressure on the institutions to do. A way of thinking about this is simply to say, currently, the institution measures success by the extent to which it brings people, it recruits clients to its service. I think one of the ways of putting downward pressure would be to say, actually, the measure of success is the extent to which all of the people that are currently in your institution are actually now in, meaningful, diverse, natural communities in interdependent relationships. And what we want is we want the money you would have used to institutionalize them so that we can begin to build community with their gifts. Now, if that's what we're doing, all on for Alinsky style organizing. But here's the thing, Jonathan, that's not what Alinsky style organizing is about. Alinsky style organizing is about getting to the table and about changing services and institutions. That's fine insofar as it goes. But my answer to your question is, it's not enough. We need ABCD as well.
Just looking at the time, and I just want to thank everybody, Donna Marie, Madeline, Cormac, Jonathan, thanks for joining us today. I just want to do a quick housekeeping here. We're going to be bringing Cormac back for 2 one-day workshops in December. It's going to be diving deeper into rekindling democracy and a lot of the ideas and insights that we talked about today. So we're going to send more information about that in the follow-up. And then you can learn a bit more about Cities Deepening Community and connect with us through our newsletter. You can sign up for that. I'm sure Heather would pop that into the chat box. And you can also listen to some of our podcasts. We dive deep into deepening community topics, talk about loneliness and poverty, talk about the importance of building strong communities. And then you can also reach out to Heather if you want to learn a bit more about membership and joining the Cities Reducing Poverty, Cities Deepening Community membership. But thank you everybody for joining us today. It was a really great discussion and I'm very lucky to have been part of it. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Ruthie.
No,
Can I show everybody the book if they haven't seen it?
I definitely recommend it. It's a good read.
Thank you.